Tara Ison is professor of fiction and creative writing program. Professor Ison's latest novel is At the Hour Between Dog and Wolf. Jessica Early, professor of English and director of the Central Writing Project, as key hub for new pedagogies within the broader constellation of the National Writing Project. Most recently, Professor Early is author of Next Generation Genres, Teaching Writing for Civic and Academic Engagement. Then Madeline Sayet is clinical assistant professor of English literature at ASU and executive director at Yale Performing Arts Program. Professor Sayet is most recently the author of the play Where We Belong. Then Laura Turchi is clinical professor of the Department of English and Arizona Center for Medieval and Renaissance Studies. She most recently published the co-authored collection Cross-Disciplinary, Cross-Institutional Collaboration in Teacher Education, Cases of Learning and Leading. And David Hawkes is also a professor of English and has long been a key theorist in new economic approaches to the study of English literature. His latest is the edited collection Money and Magic in Early Modern Drama. And Sinclair is Safiya Sinclair is associate professor of creative writing. Professor Sinclair recent memoir is Babylon. So thank you.
Thank you, Professor Broglio. I just want to say it's lovely to be here with all of you, and congratulations on the books. And thank you for organizing an event like this. So yes, my new novel is called At the Hour Between Dog and Wolf. And it is inspired by my stepmother, who was a hidden Jewish child in World War II Hungary, a little 5-year-old girl who her mother placed her with a Catholic family out on a farm. And she had a relatively positive experience, but she does remember very clearly being told, don't ever, ever cry. And she lived with this family. They were nice to her for several years, taught the Catholic prayers, given a new name, and told, you're a little Catholic girl now, and don't make a mistake and don't ever, ever cry. And so the idea of that really fascinated me. So my novel is inspired by that, but it is not her story at all. Mine is the story of a 12-year-old girl living with her parents in Paris during World War II, in the early days of the occupation. They're Jewish. Her father is killed on the street, and her mother takes her to stay underground. Takes her to stay with a Catholic family out on a farm in the middle of nowhere. And same kind of thing. She's given a new name. She is taught the Catholic prayers, and she is told, if you make a mistake, the police are going to come kill all of us. So she's traumatized. And initially, being 12 years old, she thinks, oh, I've got this. This is not a big deal. But she makes some mistakes, and she realizes she needs to commit to this false identity and take it more seriously. So over the course of the next several years, she renounces Judaism. She becomes a devout Catholic. She loses her identity in the new identity of this fictional young Catholic girl, Marie-Jeanne. And over the several years, due to the genius of the Vichy and Nazi propaganda and the anti-Semitism, the xenophobia, the racism, the fascism, by the end of the novel, she has been transformed into a devout fascist and collaborator and anti-Semite. So I was primarily interested in the psychological trajectory of that, how you take somebody with a vulnerable mind and basically terrorize them and give them this burden of a false identity to the point where they lose themselves. But I started working on this book about 25 years ago, and I never set out to write a political novel. And it wasn't until I picked it up about 6 years ago to do some more work on it that I realized how explicitly political the book is. And I was looking at sections that I had written 10, 15 years earlier that looked very much as if they, it was what I was hearing world leaders saying on the news today about immigration, about Jews, basically espousing fascism. And that was very, very disturbing to me. So even though it is World War II, I'm a little disturbed at how timely the novel has turned out to be. I just like, have we learned nothing? So.
You. Thank you for putting this together, Ron. And I'm excited to be here on the panel with you guys. It's like being at the best book group ever on a Tuesday morning. I'm going to share a little bit. This is my book, Next Generation Genres, Teaching Writing for Civic and Academic Engagement. And this stems from my years of writing research in secondary school settings and college. I started my career as a high school English teacher and got really interested in the teaching of writing because I didn't know how to do it. And I worked in an urban school setting in Portland, Oregon. And I came into the teaching of English like a lot of us in the English department because I love books and was an English major and I love to read. And I felt really confident about teaching reading and not about teaching writing. And that ended up being the question that's driven my work in my career. I went on to become a writing researcher, and I study how people learn to write in secondary settings and in the transition to college and in college. And one of the things that I'm really interested in is equity and access in terms of the teaching of writing. And oftentimes what counts as rigorous or academic writing is actually not the writing that's used in the world. And it's a 5-paragraph essay. And students learn to write the 5-paragraph literally like kindergarten on. And they do it again and again and again. With some exceptions, there's incredible teachers through the National Writing Project and who get educated in really amazing ways. But one of the things that research shows is that teachers are really underprepared to teach at all. And we have a huge teaching crisis happening. And when teachers are trained, they are often only given one class. It's a methods class that we've taught before and the teaching of writing. And then they're thrown into school settings and often asked to teach, and like me, don't know what to do other than what was done to them, which is teach the 5-paragraph essay, which can be very helpful in passing state and mandated tests. But it also can be helpful in perpetuating silence and voicelessness and lack of agency for students because they can't tell their stories, imagine their possible lives, think about how writing is really used in the world, or think that they could use their voices in that way. So what I did in this book is I used my long path of research to create a book for practitioners, the teaching of writing. And there's all sorts of genres. I use a genre framework, which is the theoretical lens that I use in thinking about how the teaching of writing, instead of what it's used, what we do in college is we teach writing often based on genre and thinking about the different ways that writing is used in the world, sort of. In high school and middle school and elementary school, teachers still teach using mode, which is not helpful for students. It's like not narrative, expository, persuasive, and poetic or creative. The problem with that is that you can have an argument that's a poem, or you can have an op-ed that's a poem. Like, these things don't actually help students understand how writing's used. So, hi. So anyway, I have a turning point essay is just one example of an essay that I have students write about a turning point in their lives. And I use this at the college level with our early start program to have students write about a time in their lives that changed them and where they profoundly shifted a lens or came to care about something. There's infographics, op-eds, podcasts, proposals, different things like that. So it's a very pragmatic book, and it's going out to teachers all over the country. And it was just featured in the Chronicle of Higher Education for teaching writing at the college level. And Norton's asked me to do a textbook for composition based on this. So that's where my work is. I'm excited about it.
Ciao, natuwi sa Chokais. Hey, everybody. My name is Maddie. I'm a Sinis of the Mohegan tribe. Really grateful to be here teaching on Akama Autumn and Peeposh land. I'm like really intrigued by the process of talking about this as a book, because I've talked about it as a play so much, but never as like a text. So I'm like, ooh, what does that even mean? Right. So this play deals with the intersection between Shakespeare language and colonialism. It's a memoir style solo performance piece that is both about my journey to the UK in 2015 to pursue a PhD in Shakespeare, and how it mirrors the journeys of my Mohegan ancestors who had to go there in the 1700s on diplomatic missions for our people. And it's also the story of a wolf who becomes a bird. So it's weird to see it, even as I've never actually engaged with this book until right now. Like, it came out and then I never looked at it. And so right now I'm like, this is really interesting. But it's really cool because it means that people are able to engage with the text, obviously, in educational environments where I'm not present. And this play has been on tour. I was performing it all of last year. It's currently being performed today in Colorado Springs by another actor, Jessica Ranville. But it's part of a national tour right now, produced by Woolly Mammoth Theater Company in association with the Folger Shakespeare Library. And that tour goes until spring of 2024. Yeah, it's really weird to try and talk about, but I'm also not going to perform it. So it's read it, I guess, if you're curious. But it's really it was written predominantly. It began being written in 2018. The first scene in the play actually starts at the border to Sweden the day after the Brexit vote, when the border guard, in a very bemused humor, instead of asking, "Why are you visiting this country?" was asking everyone coming off the plane from London, "How did you vote in the Brexit referendum?" And so it starts there for multiple reasons. One, because of this question of to remain, to leave, and the way borders get constructed between people, but also because it was always really important to everyone, all the other Native folks that I met, that the play began with a Native person in a global context, that it wasn't where you would expect the protagonist to be. So yeah, it grapples with like a lot of questions about our world in a very fluid and personal way. And now you can either read it in this lovely little thing published by Method and Drama at Bloomsbury, or you can still continue to see it on tour, which is so strange. So now I will hand this microphone over to Laura.
Oh, thank you, Maddie. You are hard to follow. Well, that's a very cool play. So I'm Laura Turchi, and I was really pumped to make a lot of teacher education jokes. And I realized Jess was going to be here, and I thought, oh, she's going to. But and also this book, so I know you all brought your copies, but Cross-Disciplinary, Cross-Institutional Collaboration in Teacher Ed is a product of collaboration to such an extent that I did actually write down a couple of things I wanted to remember, in part because it is honoring a very long-standing collaboration, which I got to be a part of for about 8 years when I was living in Houston. And so I still have emotional ties to it, but the book is probably the best product that's come out of the time that I was there. The group is called the Faculty Academy. It began in 2002 with an Annenberg Challenge grant, and at the time it was very closely aligned with the Houston Public Schools. And then weirdly enough, I think actually the organization of people, even though people come and go from this academy, the organization of people has outlasted now several grants. So different grants have paid for, like doing more cool things, but the group itself has kind of cohered over time, and it's multi-institutional at the time, mostly, or in the beginning, mostly tied into the University of Houston and Rice. Now University of Houston has several other branches, Clear Lake and Downtown and Victoria, and also Rice is still part of it. And also then a few people ran away to Texas A&M. So the group continues to kind of evolve, but it is truly multi-institutional, which is a lot of fun. And faculty of all ranks and sizes and kinds, and including postdocs and clinical and tenure and ABD grad students and some local teachers, although by the nature of the collaboration, it's been harder and harder to include public school teachers just because they're not They don't have time. They literally don't have time to play with us. As a group is a very opportunistic collaboration. That is, different grants come along and we would go after those, or go after a paper session, or go after some other kind of targeted journal. So, and it wouldn't always be everyone at all times. This is representing, I think, 27 people. And that's probably bigger than we would normally think of as the group. But in the 12 or 15 people have stayed together for a long time and through a lot of different relationships. And the book invitation came in at a time when several of us were involved in different leadership projects. And so we were thinking about, what does it mean to be a teacher educator and a leader, and what do you learn from being a leader? So a lot of that comes from that. A lot of the work was coming to terms with new roles and trying to hang on to a non-hierarchical collaboration, while at the same time different people were having different places of authority. It's also largely falls into self-study as a kind of research category, self-study and narrative inquiry. We have a lot of consciousness of the kind of narratives that are important to telling our stories, but also even figuring out what our stories are, or what we mean. To Jess's description of good writing project work, we were in many times meeting, we were basically a writing group who was writing for what, who was working on what kind of deadline, who needed what kinds of peer critiques, et cetera. I think another interesting thing about this that is like puts it in the humanities, even though it kind of walks between teacher ed, social science and other, is that people represent a lot of different fields. So they're writing about their work in English or social studies or history or other areas, while they are trying to talk about also how to prepare teachers. And the evidence is pretty interesting for what people talk about. We talk about actually, there's like accidental evidence, things that we capture from real life, notes, journaling, other things. There's intentional evidence gathering, student work, student interviews, other things that are human subjects protected and all that. And then there's analytical work. And I was going to show, but there's actually graphs in here, and other things to show that we did some stats to work on some of this. And we also had a very strong role for critical friendship, so that if you're going to tell your story, you have to tell it to multiple people and make sure that the story sort of stands up to the reasoning of people who weren't directly involved, and who can say, what is this really about? And why do you keep coming back to this story? And how does that fit into what you're writing about? So overall, the book is historical roots and development of this faculty academy, and that continues on, reflections on lessons learned from leadership, and then finally a lot of learning through practice, a lot of descriptions of great moments of success and failure, and what sense people made out of it and turned it into leadership cases in most cases. So that's me, David.
Thank you. And once again, thanks to Ron for organizing this. It's great fun. I've just had dental surgery, so forgive me if I lisp from time to time. I'll do my best. This is an edited volume. I wrote a chapter and the introduction, and then there are 8 chapters by other people. And my name is David Hawkes. The book is called Money and Magic in Early Modern Drama. And really, it's about the rise to power and cultural influence of signs, of representation, a process that I argue begins in the 16th century and continues really to the present day. The postmodern condition is often characterized as a society ruled by signs. And I think this process begins in the early modern period. First of all, there's a financial process. The discovery of America and the consequent influx of gold bullion into Europe gives rise to inflation, which causes debasement of the coinage. And in other words, the fluctuation of value, money starts to fluctuate in value. And it becomes clear that value is something different from gold bullion. Value isn't identical with precious metals. Value is a sign. And because it's a sign, it can multiply, it can become independent, it can, if you like, breed. And this process, the breeding, of financial signs is known as usury. And this period sees not only the emergence and legitimization of usury, but also massive popular protests against usury. So that's one aspect of the rise to power of signs. Another would be the Reformation, the Protestant Reformation, which gives rise to widespread iconoclasm. People break into churches to smash religious icons, believing them to be satanic, evil, and so on. This is also the era of the witch craze, when something like 100,000 people, mostly but not all of them women, were burned to death across Europe for the crime of magic. Magic had been practiced throughout Europe for centuries, but in the 16th century, it quite suddenly comes to seem evil and satanic. And I think this also has to do with the demonization of signs, because ritual magic depends upon the efficacy of signs. When you stick pins in a Cupid doll, that's supposed to hurt the person whose image is represented in the doll. So ritual magic depends on signs and the performative power of signs. This also causes a reaction in the period. And finally, the period sees the emergence of the popular commercial theatre, in which the audience is kind of asked to identify the actors with the characters they're playing, the duration of the play. In other words, the audience has to believe in the reality of signs temporarily. And this also causes a reaction known as anti-theatricalism, where throughout Europe, people campaign against the stage and want to shut it down. So there are 4 different kinds of signs rising to power, and each of the essays in this book analyzes them and the interactions between them. The book originated as a seminar at the conference of the Shakespeare Association of America in 2020, which was held online. An editor from Bloomsbury was lurking in this seminar and was interested and wrote to me and asked me to submit a book proposal. So I whittled down the number of papers to, I think it was 12 then. A couple more people dropped out along the way. Ended up with 9 chapters altogether. I wrote it thanks to a sabbatical that I was able to take from the English department here, which is very nice. It plunged me into complete poverty for probably forever, but it was well worth it, I'm sure, because the book is finally done. Anyway, that's me. Thanks a lot. I'll hand it over to Safiya.
Thank you. Thanks for having me, and it's good to be here with you all. My name is Safiya Sinclair, Jamaican poet and author of this memoir, How to Say Babylon, which is a memoir about my childhood and young adulthood growing up in a very strict Rastafari household in Jamaica, and which led to my clashes with my militant reggae musician Rasta father, and how eventually this rebellion led to me celebrating and defining womanhood on my own terms and finding my own voice as a poet. So I'll just talk a little bit about the memoir. I knew when I set out to write the book that I was going to be tackling what Rastafari means to the world. And Rastafari holds such a broad space in the global cultural imagination. Most people think that Rastafari is the thing that defines Jamaica. But actually, Rastafari are historically a persecuted minority in Jamaica. Jamaica is actually a very Christian country. We have the most churches per capita of any country in the world. And so Rastafari have always been sort of ostracized, outcast by their families, hunted by the government, outlawed by Jamaican government under colonialism. They were forbidden from having jobs. They were forbidden from walking along the beach sides that were being developed for tourists. We had a prime minister in 1963 that gave a directive to the army that said, "Bring me all Rastas dead or alive," which led to a weekend of terror in which every Rastafari that they could find in Jamaica was rounded up, jailed, forcibly shaved, their dreadlocks forcibly cut, and as much as 150 Rastafari men were tortured, wounded, an unknown number killed. And so this is kind of the reality of the history of Rastafari in Jamaica, which led to like a national isolation, that the Rastafari became kind of, they isolated themselves and formed their own society to keep away from what they call Babylon, which is the government, which is Western society, capitalism, Christianity, ideologies of Europe and America. All of this, everything they think is antithetical to what they believe, they call Babylon. And so this is kind of the historical context of Rastafari. And so, I grew up in my family in the sense of like national isolation. My siblings and I were always an oddity growing up. We were among the first Rasta children to actually be allowed into public schools in the 1980s. We were always the only Rasta children at school, the only Rasta children at the supermarket, the only Rasta children on the bus. I had friends say they couldn't speak to me because I was a Rasta. As recently as a few years ago, my brother was rejected from jobs because he wouldn't cut his dreadlocks. And so this sense of isolation kind of formed how I started thinking of my sense of self. But also within my family, I began to feel isolated by the rules of Rastafari, which were different for women than they were for men. Women had to wear long skirts and dresses that cover their knees and their arms and elbows. You had to cover your hair. You had to eat a certain way, think a certain way. Silence was what was required of women in my household. And Rastafari also had to wear dreadlocks. It's not a choice. It was kind of forced upon me and my sisters. And so I began to question these rules as I grew older. And when I was a teenager, these led to clashes between me and my father. And a teenager, I decided to cut my dreadlocks. And didn't go so well. My father, didn't speak to me for a year. We lived in the same house, and he looked through me like I was a ghost. I had become Babylon. After this, my middle sister cut her dreadlocks, and then my youngest sister cut her dreadlocks, and finally my mother, after growing her dreadlocks since she was 19 years old when she met my father, cut her dreadlocks. And this was kind of the defining moment in my family's life and in my life. And my father saw me as, I think, sort of the ultimate corruption of what he envisioned his Rasta family to be. And he became violent. And I knew that if I didn't leave Jamaica, I wouldn't survive. And so I did. And I was gone for years. I didn't speak to him for years. And I then had to do a poetry reading in Jamaica, and I went back and I invited my father and my brother to come hear me read my poetry for the first time. And I read for him a poem. I wanted to be heard. I wanted him to hear me for the first time, to speak to him actually for the first time. And at the end of the poetry reading, he came up to me, my father embraced me, and he whispered in my ear, "I'm listening and I hear you." And so I wrote this book not just as a way of looking forward, a way of looking backward and thinking about family history, about generational trauma, about colonial violence, about the history of Jamaica, about Rastafari history, but I also wrote this book as a bridge of possibilities to the future. I wrote this book for my niece and for every other Sinclair girl yet to come, for all the women of Jamaica whose hands and words and work made me. This is why I wrote this book, so that she who comes next will know herself, and that she who comes next will survive. This is how to say Babylon.
Thank you all for this, and the great thing is we have some time. So we have some time to just sort of talk about some themes, some threads, and Safiya, really, how to say Babylon, really the question of audience. So this is a question I have for everyone: is when you write a book, you often have an audience in mind. Sometimes for me, it's an actual person, like I can visualize the more concretely I can, visualize that happened. That helps. So I'm wondering, the audience you're writing for, and then the audience that ends up actually reading it out when it's out in the world, and how those don't always coincide, and these strange and interesting kinds of differences that happen. I mean, Tara, you're talking about, you're writing a historical thing, and then it comes out and it's a very different audience in the world. So I was wondering if maybe some of you can talk about this issues of audience.
Before we do that, I'm so moved by I'm moved by being here and just hearing everyone do it. But I was just so beautiful, and to share, I think a memoir, I'm not saying it's different or better or anything, but it's like putting your heart out there. And I want to honor that before just moving on. It feels weird to just, I don't know. Thank you.
Yeah. It's interesting. Next semester, we want to do something on Spirit of the Law, called Spirit of the Law, which is about kind of waywardness, and particularly it has to do with religious waywardness. That I grew up in a very Catholic, very, very disciplined Catholic background. And so obviously became rather wayward. But how those things influence you in different ways, the push and pull of it, and how it shows up in the writing. So I might be calling on some of you in the future when we do this waywardness thing. It will be more of an after hours event, since it's has the idea of a Spirit of the Law and waywardness to it. But I think it's amazing how the personal ends up, even if it's memoir, certainly, but even when it's not memoir, just influences how we think and write. It's really amazing. So maybe we can think about that as well. Yeah. So tell us about your waywardness.
Wait, but we're not talking about waywardness. We're talking about audience, right? We're going back to that. Okay. I was so fascinated. I was heading down the wayward path, and it was really interesting. Yeah, as I said, I did not set out to write a political novel. I set out to write a psychological novel about identity and the fragility of identity. And I think I always assumed that the audience for this book would primarily be Jewish people who had relatives who were in the Holocaust, who were in the war, who survived or didn't survive. But given where we are at in time, I think that, the novel at its core is how to turn someone into a xenophobic, racist, anti-Semitic fascist. And so I'm hoping for a broader audience for this book, because I'd like a lot of right-wing people to read this book thinking that they're just reading a book of historical fiction about something sort of safely and comfortably in the past. And as the anti-Semitism and fascism and racism sneaks up on my character and consumes her and, warps her, I would like a reader who perhaps has such leanings. I would like it for it to creep up on them also. And again, because it's historical fiction, perhaps it's coming at them from a safer distance, that they might have an experience of it that is different from a contemporary novel or contemporary nonfiction that is sort of, finger wagging and is easy to dismiss as, elitist liberal propaganda. So that's what I'm hoping for. We're hoping. It's my agent's trying. what's going on in the world. So audience, I mean, of course I would always want a very broad audience to sell a whole lot of books, but I'm actually hoping it's a broader audience than I had initially envisioned for the book.
So my audience is teachers, and it's me when I taught at Cleveland High School in Portland, Oregon, and I didn't know how to teach writing. And so I'm writing for that teacher who was starting out, and I had a counselor come to my class, and I worked to untrack our English department because most English departments have a regular class set, an honors class, and the college or whatever, IB, whatever you want to name it. And I taught the same rigorous curriculum to everyone. And I remember inviting the counselor in to talk to all my students, and she said, I'll come to your regular class, but not your honors class. Your honors class, but not your regular class, because they're not going to college. And I said, no, and I've been working against that ever since. And one of the ways that we keep students silent and thinking they're only regular is by teaching them to write 5-paragraph essays over and over and over again, and not giving them a voice and not letting them share what they care about. And I started working as an activist in Portland with Rethinking Schools. And so this work is actually for teachers to think about what is possible. And it's often considered not scholarly because it's how to, but it makes a huge difference, and it goes out to teachers, and it impacts students all over the country. And I'm proud of it. And then I also am pushing against college composition, because there is a huge sense that what happens there needs to be something, and it's not true. So when I first started this, I was actually asked to write a college composition text, and it went out to reviewers, and they said, no, this is too radical. This isn't rhetoric and composition. And I was like, F you, I'm going to write this. And I did. And now they want it. The other thing that it features mainly is examples from students and teachers. And so it's also a very, very much a part of my research in showing what really wonderful writers and teachers of writing are doing. So those are my audiences.
This is a very complicated question for this because of it being a play. So when I first wrote this, I did not intend to share it with anyone. It was just a process. I don't even know if I honestly really considered myself a writer at that point. And then it somehow, by whirlwind of events, was supposed to be performed at Shakespeare's Globe. And so I said, okay, well, I will go and I will be in that space, and I will say the things to that space that I need to say. And I will honor my ancestor, who's, Mohammed Weonamun, who's buried at Southwark Cathedral and wasn't able to come home, and who's very close physically to that space. And so that first sharing was very much about honoring the fact that we went there too, that this wasn't an exchange that went in one direction. And then the last year I was on tour, again, not necessarily thinking it was a good idea to be on tour sharing my personal story over and over again, because of sort of the emotional cost of that. But what I did essentially for a year was physically watch audiences. And so the reason I say that is because I think the text audience is something else, but the act of watching audiences physically for an entire year was a very interesting thing. One, in terms of what is the makeup of the audiences in the American theater, who is being invited to these spaces, who is not. I have an accountability rider that goes with the play that was intended to try and keep the play from being turned into too much of a colonial force, because my concern was if the story went many places, it would be displacing the native stories that should be being told in each place. And so there's a bunch of steps the theaters have to take, but then within that also the prologue and epilogue change each performance. The prologue is always a story of the place and the native peoples of the place where the story is being told that day, that's developed in collaboration with that community. And then the epilogue always updates us to the moment in time we were currently in. And that's largely because was so steeped in oral tradition that then the turning of it into a text then becomes like, wait, Now it's a stat. What is that? Like, that's a whole different thing. And so the weird thing is like this text, I'm like very conscious of like, you're not getting a prologue of wherever you are when you read it necessarily. It has, like a version of the prologue. But I say that because I think the visceral experience of audience over the course of the year meant that I became afraid of the audience, because early on there were certain venues where maybe they hadn't explained correctly to the audience what it was about, and then they yell at me because they don't want to deal with colonialism today, or they don't want, and then carrying that in your body when you go to the next audience, what does that mean? And I remember when I performed it at the Public Theater in New York, there was a performance that was an all Indigenous audience performance. And I just remember it being, oh, wait, like this is the first time I'm breathing again, telling the show, because I wasn't scared of the audience anymore. And so when you asked that question, I know it's a long answer, but I thought about all of that because I was like, I don't know who's reading it. Like, like I was like, it could be anything. But I think that for me, there was a lot of thought that went into, because it is steeped in oral tradition, because when I tell it, my ancestors are in the space with me. What does it mean for them to be missing a lot of information? And so I tried to put in very clever footnotes so that they would at least understand it was funny and things like that. But that I think the space in which it's being engaged the most, which I think is a very interesting space for it, is in classes, where maybe they aren't thinking about these things, they aren't engaging with these ideas. And one of my favorite things that someone said to me recently, having taught it in a class, was their students really appreciated spoilers. I mean, there's a scene in it in which I quit my PhD, and the students really appreciated the sense of it being okay, that actually like that's like you can leave an institutional space and it's not a moral failing, that there are like all of these different pathways. And so I think now I really appreciate this as because it is the journey of someone, right, like in a certain age bracket, in a certain kind of institutional space, grappling with all of their ancestors. I appreciate that other students can engage with it and find things from it that might be useful to them. Sorry, that was a long answer, but I watched so many I've just been watching audiences for like so long right now, for good and for bad. I've been watching. So
what do you see in us, right? In this, or we're not the audience, right? Exactly. Amazing. I know I use the word collaboration many, many times in describing my book. And I think, even to say my book is strange, my book in the context of this room, it's like, this is the one I'm talking about. But the entire audience, I think for this, a very large part of the audience for this is ourselves, strangely enough, because they are self-study projects and different research. And so voices that don't otherwise maybe have a place in educational research, or have a very limited voice, and the opportunity to write this one in terms of leadership meant that we had to grapple with what we wanted to tell ourselves about what it meant to be leaders, and to not be a part of a nice collaborative family, but to have to make hard decisions and things. So in many ways, the audience was like, can I remember who I was when I was writing this book and thinking about those transitions? But other people go through some of the same situations, and in the world of narrative inquiry and self-study and teacher ed is actually pretty robust. So this book joins some other good collections on people figuring stuff out and doing it in part through writing about it, which is maybe another theme for our panel here.
Thanks. Well, this book really is aimed at academics, hoping that my colleagues will read it and cite it in their own work. A lot depends on whether it comes out in paperback. If it's well reviewed and, maybe mentioned in other people's work, it might get published in paperback, in which case it might actually appear in bookshops and somebody might buy it. Otherwise, it's mostly academics that is the intended audience. That's pretty much it.
I can say I wrote this book with an anti-audience in mind, like deliberately trying not to think about who was going to read it, but primarily what what my father would think or what my mother would think, and then what my siblings would think, like in that order. And so I found that kind of trying my best to write the book in the vacuum of thinking about an audience was the only way I could write it. And then eventually, after I had like the first draft and I had to, call my family for a lot of it to talk about their recollections of things, or, asking them how they remembered something, or I called my father and my brother for to really make sure I had some of the facts of Rastafari right, made sure I had the vernacular correct in the dialogue and so on. And so then I started to think, okay, this book is for them first. So that's the first audience. I hope they like it. Next, Jamaica. That's a big one. My whole country, my whole nation. In a lot of sense, the book is also a love song to Jamaica, in that what I want audiences to take away, particularly global audiences outside of Jamaica, is an actual new or a fresh idea of what Jamaica is, what it really is like to grow up as a young woman in Jamaica, what it's like to grow up in a Rastafari household in Jamaica. I want to break these stereotypes that people have of Jamaica, of it just being Bob Marley, reggae music, tourism. I want to say something about Jamaica outside of the tourist ad, and to sort of deepen the understanding of Jamaican life, Jamaican history, Caribbean selfhood, Jamaican womanhood. And so if I were to think of audiences, that's the kind of way I would think about it. I also think the book is for everyone, but also for women or young women or anyone who feels that they were made small by patriarchal and colonial systems. Anyone who had to come into themselves in a difficult way, or had to find their own power in, coming against these colonial or patriarchal systems as a woman or femme, or, as a person who wasn't always given a voice in the world. So
Yeah, I think that's great. I wouldn't kind of leave it with there must be a better way. It's why we write, it's why we do what we do. Other worlds are possible, people. And why we have these panels is kind of partly for that, to show the many worlds and the incredible dedication and commitment of each of our authors here, and the years and hours and days and toil that is both academic but emotional and personal. I think it comes out for all of us here in the variety of work, and really serves as an inspiration, hopefully for everyone, for the next thing they'll be doing, that these other worlds are possible and you can write them into being. So thank you all for joining us today.